We need to review the prime rate hike and its impact on the loan portfolio.
The projections look solid, but we should stress test the covenants.
The lobby of City Trust Bank was already busy. It was just after 9 in the morning, the time when employees hurried between offices and customers lined up at the service counters with documents in their hands. The polished floor reflected the movement of people crossing the wide space, shoes clicking against the marble as conversations blended together. Near the center of the lobby, a woman in a blue cleaning uniform pushed a small cart. Her name was Grace Okafor. Most people in the building simply called her Mama Grace. She held a mop in her hands and worked carefully across the floor, making sure the area near the reception desk stayed clean as customers stepped in and out of the entrance. Grace kept her eyes on the ground as she worked. She had learned long ago that if she focused on the job, the long hours passed more quickly. A group of young bankers stood a few steps away near the elevator. They were new employees, fresh out of university, dressed in expensive suits that still carried the confidence of people who believed the world had already opened its doors to them. One of them glanced toward Grace and nudged the colleague beside him. "Look at that," he said with a quiet laugh. "She's been mopping that same floor since I started here last month." Another banker smirked. "She's probably been doing it for years." A third joined in. "Imagine spending your whole life cleaning other people's mess." The group laughed. Grace heard every word. But she didn't respond. She simply continued pushing the mop across the floor, her movements slow and steady. Several employees nearby noticed the comments. None of them said anything. It was easier to pretend not to hear. One of the bankers leaned closer to his friend and spoke louder this time. "You know what's funny?" he said. "Some people never move forward in life. They just stay in the same place forever." More laughter followed. Grace kept working. Then something changed. The elevator doors opened. A group of senior executives stepped out into the lobby. The bankers immediately straightened their jackets. Because walking behind those executives was a man everyone in the building recognized. The CEO of City Trust Bank. Conversation stopped. Employees stood a little straighter. Managers near the reception desk hurried forward to greet him. But the CEO didn't stop. He walked past them. Past the reception desk. Past the group of bankers who had been laughing moments earlier. His eyes were fixed on only one person. Grace. The bankers looked confused as the CEO walked directly toward the cleaner with the mop. Grace noticed the sudden silence and slowly lifted her head. Before she could say anything, the CEO gently took the mop from her hands. Then he pulled her into a warm embrace. His voice carried clearly across the lobby. "Good morning, Mom." For a moment, no one moved. The same bankers who had been laughing seconds earlier now stared in disbelief. Because the cleaner they had just mocked was standing in the arms of the most powerful man in the building. The silence inside the lobby felt heavier than any noise that had filled it moments earlier. The young bankers who had been laughing stood frozen where they were. One of them blinked rapidly as if he had misheard what had just been said. Did he just say Mom?" one whispered under his breath. Another banker glanced nervously at the others. The laughter that had seemed so easy a moment ago had vanished completely. Managers near the reception desk looked just as confused. They had rushed forward expecting to greet the CEO, but now they stood awkwardly a few steps away, unsure whether to approach. Grace herself looked stunned. The mop was no longer in her hands. The CEO still held her shoulders gently, smiling the way a proud son smiles when he sees someone he loves after a long day. Around them, employees and customers stared openly. Some whispered. Some simply watched in disbelief. Because the woman they had passed every morning without a second thought was being embraced by the man who ran the entire bank. The narrator pauses for a moment. "Before I explain why the CEO of one of the largest banks in the country just hugged a cleaning lady in front of the entire staff, take a second to subscribe. Because stories like this remind us of something many people forget once they start chasing status and titles. Respect should never depend on a person's job." Now let's go back to the beginning. Because this moment inside the bank lobby didn't start here. It started many years earlier, with a mother who refused to give up on her child. Because the moment inside the lobby did not begin with a hug. And it certainly did not begin with a powerful title. It began years earlier in a very different part of the city. A place where tall glass buildings did not dominate the skyline and where success was measured in much simpler ways. The city itself never slowed down. Buses carried workers across crowded streets every morning. Vendors opened their stalls along the roadside. Shops lifted their metal shutters as people rushed through another busy day. In the middle of the financial district stood the headquarters of City Trust Bank. A massive building with polished floors, glass walls, and offices filled with people making decisions about money, investments, and corporate growth. Every day hundreds of employees passed through its doors. Bankers, managers, security guards, receptionists, cleaners. Most people inside that building had clear titles and well-defined roles. But one woman moved quietly through the hallways long before the workday officially began. Her name was Grace Okafor. To the employees of City Trust Bank, she was simply the cleaner. The woman who arrived early every morning with a cart, a mop, and a quiet determination to make the building spotless before the first customer walked through the doors. Few people knew anything about her life outside the bank. Few people asked. To them, Grace was simply part of the building. But long before the young bankers laughed at her in that lobby, Grace had already lived through years of sacrifice that most of them could not imagine. Because the woman pushing that cleaning cart had once faced a choice that would define the rest of her life. A choice between surrender and hope. Grace Okafor had not planned the life she ended up living. When she was younger, she imagined something simple. A stable home, a husband who worked hard, children who would grow up safely, and evenings spent together after long but honest days. For a while, that life existed. Her husband worked at a small manufacturing plant just outside the city. The pay was modest, but it was enough to keep food on the table and rent paid on time. Their apartment was small, yet it was filled with laughter and the hopeful noise of a young family. Their son Daniel was the center of that happiness. He was only 4 years old when everything changed. One afternoon, Grace received a knock on the door that every family fears. 2 men from the factory stood outside, their expressions serious. There had been an accident at the plant. By the time Grace reached the hospital, her husband was gone. In a single moment, the future she had imagined disappeared. Friends and relatives tried to comfort her during those first difficult weeks, but many of them also offered advice she did not want to hear. "You are still young," one relative told her. "Send the boy to the village. Let family help raise him while you start over." Another said something similar. "Life in the city is too hard for a woman alone with a child." Grace listened quietly. But inside, she had already made her decision. Daniel would stay with her. No matter how difficult things became, she would raise her son herself. The months that followed tested that promise in ways she had never expected. The small savings she and her husband had managed to gather disappeared quickly. Rent still had to be paid. Food still had to be bought. Daniel still needed clothes and school supplies. Grace began taking any work she could find. She cleaned office buildings during the day. In the evenings, she cooked simple meals, rice, beans, fried plantains, and sold them from a small roadside stand. The days were long. The nights were even longer. Sometimes she returned home so exhausted she could barely remove her shoes before falling asleep. But every morning she woke up and started again. Because every sacrifice had a single purpose: Daniel's future. And Grace was determined that nothing, not grief, not exhaustion, not poverty, would take that away from him. Life became a constant cycle of work and responsibility. Grace's mornings began before the sun rose. She prepared Daniel for school, made sure he ate something warm, and walked him to the nearby classroom building before heading to her own job. During the day, she cleaned office spaces for companies that barely noticed her presence. She wiped desks, emptied trash bins, and swept hallways while employees rushed past discussing meetings and business deals. Most of them never asked her name. To them, she was simply the cleaner. But Grace didn't take offense. She understood something many people forgot. Every honest job carried dignity. When her cleaning shift ended, she didn't go home to rest. Instead, she went straight to the roadside where she set up her small food stand. Using a portable stove and a few cooking pots, she prepared simple meals for evening workers, drivers, mechanics, security guards, and anyone looking for an affordable plate of food after a long day. Sometimes business was good. Sometimes she barely sold enough to cover the cost of ingredients. But every coin mattered. Every coin helped pay for Daniel's school uniform, books, and tuition. There were nights when Grace counted the small pile of money on her table and realized it wouldn't stretch far enough. On those nights, she quietly adjusted the plan. Daniel would eat a full dinner. She would eat later, or sometimes not at all. Daniel never knew. To him, his mother was simply strong. He saw her wake up every morning with determination and return home every night with the same quiet smile. Grace never spoke about the difficulties in front of him. Instead, she repeated one message over and over again. "Education will open doors for you," she would say while helping him with his homework. "Once those doors open, walk through them with confidence." Daniel listened carefully. Even as a child, he could see the sacrifices behind those words. He watched his mother's tired hands after long days of work. He noticed how she sometimes skipped meals. He saw the way she protected his future even when her own comfort disappeared. And deep inside, Daniel made a promise to himself. One day he would make all of it worth it. One day he would build a life where his mother no longer had to struggle the way she did now. But for the moment he had only one tool to begin fulfilling that promise. Hard work. And he was ready to use it. Daniel grew into the kind of student teachers noticed quickly. He wasn't loud in class. He didn't try to impress anyone. But whenever assignments were given, he completed them with a level of care that stood out. Numbers came easily to him. Mathematics became his favorite subject, followed closely by economics. While other children spent afternoons playing in the streets, Daniel often sat beside the small table in their apartment studying his schoolbooks. Grace watched quietly from the kitchen area while preparing food for her evening customers. Sometimes she worried that Daniel worked too hard for someone his age. But she also understood something important. He wasn't studying because anyone forced him to. He was studying because he had seen what life demanded. One afternoon when Daniel was about 12 years old, he came home holding a paper from school. Grace wiped her hands on a towel and looked at it carefully. It was a letter from his teacher. Daniel had achieved the highest marks in his class. The teacher recommended that he apply for a regional academic scholarship program when he reached secondary school. Grace read the letter twice before looking up at her son. "You did this?" she asked softly. Daniel nodded. She pulled him into a tight embrace. For a moment, the exhaustion of her long workdays disappeared. Because this was the future she had been working toward. Years passed. Daniel continued excelling in school. Teachers encouraged him, often staying after class to help him prepare for exams and scholarship opportunities. When the time came to apply for university, Daniel competed for one of the most prestigious scholarship programs available. The competition was intense. Students from wealthy families applied. Students from elite schools applied. But Daniel carried something many of them did not. Determination born from sacrifice. Weeks later the acceptance letter arrived. Daniel had earned a full scholarship to study finance and economics at a leading university. Grace held the letter with trembling hands. For several seconds she couldn't speak. All the years of waking before sunrise. All the evenings selling food on the roadside. All the nights counting coins to pay school fees. They had led to this moment. She looked at Daniel with tears in her eyes. "The door has opened," she whispered. Daniel nodded. "And I'm walking through it." Neither of them realized then just how far that door would eventually lead. University opened a new world for Daniel Okafor. For the first time in his life he was surrounded by students from every part of the country. Many from families with far more resources than he had ever known. Some arrived on campus in expensive cars. Others spoke casually about family businesses and international travel. Daniel noticed the differences immediately. But instead of feeling discouraged, he focused on the one thing that had always guided him. His work. He attended every lecture prepared, often sitting near the front of the room so he could absorb every detail. After classes ended, he spent hours in the university library reviewing financial models, studying economic systems, and learning how large institutions managed money and risk. Professors began to notice his dedication. One of them, an economics lecturer named Professor Adetola, often stayed after class to discuss complex ideas with him. "You ask questions that show real understanding," the professor once told him. Not many students look beyond the surface of the numbers. Daniel smiled politely but never mentioned why he worked so hard. Every late night of study carried the memory of his mother's sacrifices. While other students worried about social events or weekend trips, Daniel remained focused on building the future he had promised himself. During his final year, he secured an internship at a financial consulting firm. It was his first real exposure to the professional world of banking and investment. The environment was demanding. Analysts worked long hours reviewing market data and preparing reports for senior executives. But Daniel adapted quickly. His ability to analyze financial patterns and explain complex information clearly impressed his supervisors. When the internship ended, the firm offered him a full-time position. It was the first major step of a journey that would eventually carry him into the highest levels of the banking industry. But even as Daniel entered that new world of boardrooms and corporate strategy, one person remained at the center of every decision he made: his mother. Daniel's career advanced faster than even he expected. At the consulting firm, he started as a junior analyst. His job was simple at first: review financial reports, organize data, and assist senior analysts preparing presentations for corporate clients. But Daniel approached every assignment with the same seriousness he had carried throughout school. He studied market trends late into the night. He reviewed investment strategies long after others had gone home. And when senior executives asked questions during meetings, Daniel often had answers ready. Within 2 years he was promoted. Then promoted again. Colleagues began to recognize something unusual about him. Daniel didn't chase attention. He didn't brag about achievements. He simply worked quietly and consistently until results spoke for themselves. Eventually his reputation reached the leadership team at Citi Trust Bank, a financial institution that had been struggling to adapt to changes in the industry. The board of directors wanted fresh thinking. They wanted someone who understood both numbers and people. Daniel joined the bank as part of a strategic advisory team assigned to help restructure operations. His ideas quickly stood out. He introduced smarter investment strategies, improved internal efficiency, and built stronger relationships with major clients. Profits began to rise. Within a few years, Daniel moved from advisor to executive director. And then something remarkable happened. When the bank's previous CEO stepped down during a major transition period, the board faced a difficult decision about who should lead the institution forward. Many experienced candidates were considered, but one name kept returning to the discussion: Daniel Okafor. He was younger than most CEOs in the industry, but he had proven something more important than age. He understood responsibility. The board voted, and Daniel became the new chief executive officer of Citi Trust Bank. The boy who once studied under a small lamp in a modest apartment had now reached the highest office in one of the largest banks in the country. Yet despite the title, Daniel never forgot the lesson that guided him long before the world began calling him CEO. Respect people, especially those who worked the hardest. Life inside Citi Trust Bank moved quickly. Every day the building filled with people dressed in tailored suits, carrying laptops and folders filled with financial reports. Meetings started early and often continued well into the afternoon as teams discussed investments, client portfolios, and expansion plans. For many employees, working at the bank was more than just a job. It was a symbol of status. Young professionals who joined the company often spoke proudly about their positions. They compared salaries, promotions, and performance bonuses as if those numbers defined their value. The higher someone climbed within the organization, the more attention they received. Titles mattered. Corner offices mattered. The way people dressed and carried themselves mattered. In an environment like that, certain workers faded into the background. Security guards, reception staff, cleaning crews. They were necessary for the building to function, but they rarely became part of the conversations that filled conference rooms and executive offices. Grace Okafor was one of those invisible figures. Every morning she arrived long before most employees stepped through the doors. With her cleaning cart beside her, she moved quietly through the lobby and hallways. She mopped the floors. She emptied waste bins. She wiped the conference tables where senior managers would later sit and discuss business strategies worth millions. By the time the first bankers arrived, the building was already spotless. But very few people ever asked who had prepared it that way. To most employees, Grace was simply the cleaner. A familiar presence they passed every day without thinking twice. They didn't know her story. They didn't know the sacrifices she had made. And they certainly didn't know that the most powerful man in the building owed his entire success to the woman pushing that cart through the hallways. Among the newest employees at Citi Trust Bank was a group of young investment associates who had joined the company only a few months earlier. They were talented, ambitious, and eager to prove themselves. But they also carried something else: pride. Most of them had graduated from prestigious universities. Their resumes were filled with internships, academic awards, and recommendations from influential professors. They walked through the bank's halls with confidence that sometimes bordered on arrogance. During lunch breaks they gathered near the elevators or in the staff lounge discussing promotions, bonuses, and future career plans. To make it here, one of them liked to say, "You have to stand out." And in their minds, standing out meant being different from people who worked in roles they considered less important. One morning, as employees began arriving for work, the group stood near the main lobby talking loudly. Grace was nearby pushing her cleaning cart. She moved slowly across the polished floor, making sure the entrance area stayed spotless for the customers who would soon arrive. One of the young bankers glanced toward her and smirked. "You know what amazes me?" he said to his colleagues. "Some people spend their whole lives in the same job." Another banker laughed. "Imagine coming to the same building every day just to clean it." A third added, "Maybe that's what happens when you don't aim higher." The group chuckled. Grace heard them. But she kept her head down and continued working. She had heard similar comments before. Words spoken carelessly by people who didn't understand that every honest job carries its own dignity. A few employees nearby noticed the conversation and looked uncomfortable. But no one stepped in. Because challenging arrogance in a corporate environment was not always easy. And the young bankers believed they were simply telling the truth. They had no idea that within minutes, their assumptions about success were about to collapse in front of the entire bank. Before we continue, let me ask you something. Have you ever seen someone judged unfairly because of the work they do? If you believe respect should never depend on a job title, take a moment to subscribe. Because the lesson these bankers were about to learn would stay with them for the rest of their careers. That morning in the lobby started like any other. Customers were already arriving for their appointments. Some stood in line at the customer service desks while others waited for meetings with loan officers and account managers. The building carried the steady movement of a typical business day. Grace pushed her cart slowly across the wide floor near the entrance, guiding the mop carefully so no one would slip on the damp surface. The young bankers were still standing near the elevators. One of them glanced again in Grace's direction and shook his head. "I swear," he said with a laugh, "she's been cleaning that same floor since my first day here." Another banker leaned against the wall. "Maybe longer," he replied. "People like that never move forward." Grace heard the comment clearly. Her hands tightened slightly around the handle of the mop, but she didn't look up. Instead, she continued working the way she always did. Slow, careful, focused. The bankers continued their conversation, now louder than before. "You know the funny part?" one of them said. "Some people spend their entire lives doing the same thing and think that's normal." Another added, "That's why you have to aim higher." A few employees nearby shifted uncomfortably. A receptionist glanced toward Grace with sympathy but said nothing. Grace dipped the mop into the bucket and wrung it out quietly. She had faced enough challenges in her life to know that careless words did not define her worth. Still, hearing laughter directed at her was never easy. The bankers were about to continue their jokes when the elevator doors opened. The sound cut through their conversation. Several senior executives stepped into the lobby first. The bankers immediately straightened their posture. Because following behind those executives was someone every employee recognized instantly. The chief executive officer of City Trust Bank. Conversations around the lobby stopped. Managers near the front desk quickly moved forward to greet him. But something unusual happened. Instead of walking toward the management team, the CEO continued straight across the lobby floor, toward the cleaner holding the mop. And suddenly, everyone in the building realized something important was about to happen. The CEO moved across the lobby with calm, steady steps. Every employee in the building knew who he was. Daniel Okafor. The man responsible for leading City Trust Bank through one of the most successful periods in its history. Managers straightened their jackets. Assistants stopped what they were doing. Even the young bankers who had been laughing moments earlier suddenly became silent. They expected the CEO to walk toward the reception desk or greet the senior executives waiting near the elevators. But Daniel didn't stop. He walked directly across the polished floor, past the managers, past the bankers, past the reception area, until he stood only a few feet away from Grace. The lobby had grown completely quiet now. Grace noticed the silence first. She paused and slowly lifted her head. Standing in front of her was the most powerful man in the entire company. For a brief moment she looked confused. Then Daniel smiled. Not the polite smile executives often use during meetings. A real smile. Warm. Proud. He reached forward gently and took the mop from her hands. "Let me hold that for a second," he said softly. Grace blinked in surprise. "Sir, I'm sorry, I didn't realize." Before she could finish the sentence, Daniel stepped forward and wrapped his arms around her in a tight embrace. Gasps spread across the lobby. The young bankers stared in disbelief. One of them whispered, "What is happening?" Grace stood frozen for a moment, still trying to understand. Then Daniel spoke clearly enough for everyone nearby to hear. "Good morning, Mom." The words echoed through the silent lobby. The bankers who had been laughing moments earlier looked as if the ground had disappeared beneath them. Managers exchanged stunned glances. Employees whispered among themselves. Because the cleaner they had ignored every day was standing in the arms of the CEO. And suddenly the entire bank realized something they had completely missed. The woman they had treated as invisible was the reason the man running the company existed at all. For a few seconds after Daniel spoke, the lobby remained completely silent. The bankers who had been laughing earlier stared at each other with wide eyes. One of them rubbed the back of his neck nervously, unsure where to look. Managers near the reception desk looked just as surprised. because no one in the building had ever heard the CEO speak about his family before. Grace slowly stepped back from the embrace. Her eyes searched Daniel's face with a mixture of pride and disbelief. "You didn't tell me you were visiting today," she said quietly. Daniel smiled. "I wanted to surprise you." The employees around them leaned closer, listening carefully. Daniel turned slightly so his voice carried across the lobby. "This woman," he said, placing a gentle hand on Grace's shoulder, "is the reason I'm standing here today." Some of the bankers lowered their heads, because the words were already beginning to sting. "My mother worked harder than anyone I have ever known," Daniel continued. He looked around the room. "When my father died, she raised me alone." Grace tried to interrupt. "Daniel, you don't have to." But Daniel shook his head gently. "They should know." His voice remained calm, but every word carried weight. "She worked during the day cleaning offices," he explained. "In the evenings she cooked food and sold it by the roadside so she could pay for my school fees." Employees who had once walked past Grace without noticing now looked at her with a completely different expression. Daniel continued. "There were days when we barely had enough to eat." Grace lowered her eyes. "But she never complained," Daniel said. "She only told me one thing." He paused briefly. "Study hard. Because education will open doors." The lobby was so quiet now that even the sound of distant footsteps echoed faintly from the hallway. Daniel looked at the young bankers who had mocked Grace earlier. "And every opportunity I've had in my life," he said slowly, "exists because this woman refused to give up on her child." The bankers shifted uncomfortably. Because the cleaner they had just laughed at had sacrificed everything to raise the man who now controlled their careers. The weight of Daniel's words settled heavily over the lobby. The young bankers who had laughed earlier now stood stiffly near the elevators, their earlier confidence completely gone. One of them cleared his throat nervously, but no one spoke. Daniel looked at them calmly. "You were saying something a few minutes ago," he said. The banker who had made the first joke stared at the floor. "Sir, we didn't mean." Daniel raised his hand slightly. "I heard enough." His voice wasn't angry, but it carried authority that made the entire room pay attention. "You spoke about people who never move forward in life," Daniel continued. No one responded. "So let me ask you something." He looked directly at them. "What do you think success really looks like?" The bankers exchanged uncertain glances. None of them answered. Daniel nodded slowly. "That's what I thought." He turned slightly so the rest of the employees could hear him as well. "This bank employs hundreds of people," he said. "Analysts, managers, security staff, maintenance workers." His hand rested gently on Grace's shoulder. "Every single one of them deserves respect." Several employees nodded quietly. Daniel continued. "A company doesn't succeed because of titles." He gestured toward the spotless floor around them. "It succeeds because people do their jobs with integrity." The bankers looked more uncomfortable by the second. Daniel turned back toward them. "If you want to work in an organization I lead," he said firmly, "you will learn to respect the people who make that organization possible." The words landed clearly. One of the bankers finally spoke. "We're sorry, sir." Daniel didn't respond immediately. Instead, he looked toward Grace. She stood quietly beside him, still holding the cleaning cart. Then Daniel spoke again. "Apologize to the person you insulted." The banker swallowed. Slowly the group stepped forward. And for the first time since they joined the bank, they looked directly at the woman they had mocked. The young bankers stood in front of Grace, their confidence gone. The same people who had laughed moments earlier now struggled to meet her eyes. One of them spoke first. "Ma'am, we're sorry," he said quietly. The others nodded in agreement. Grace looked at them for a moment. Her face showed no anger, only calm. "I accept your apology," she said gently. The simplicity of her response surprised them. Daniel watched the exchange with quiet approval. Then he turned back toward the employees gathered around the lobby. "There's something else everyone here should know," he said. The room grew still again. "My mother never told anyone who I was." Grace lowered her eyes slightly, embarrassed by the attention. "She insisted on keeping her job," Daniel continued, "even after I asked her many times to retire." A few employees looked at Grace with admiration. Daniel smiled. "She said honest work keeps a person strong." Grace nodded softly. "That's what I believe." Daniel then addressed the management team standing nearby. "Starting today, City Trust Bank will create a scholarship fund in her name." The announcement sparked quiet murmurs. "It will support students from families who struggle financially but show exceptional dedication to their studies." Grace looked surprised. "Daniel, you don't need to do that." "Yes, I do," he replied. He looked around the room again. "Because my story didn't begin in this office." He placed his hand gently on Grace's shoulder. "It began with a mother who refused to give up." Several employees began clapping softly. The applause spread across the lobby. Soon the entire room was filled with the sound of people recognizing the woman who had quietly worked among them for years. Grace stood there slightly overwhelmed. Not because she wanted attention, but because, for the first time since she started working in that building, people were finally seeing her. The applause in the lobby slowly faded, but the atmosphere inside the building had changed. Employees who had once walked past Grace without a glance were now looking at her with genuine respect. Some approached quietly to shake her hand. Others simply nodded as they passed, acknowledging the woman whose sacrifices had shaped the leader of their company. Daniel watched the scene unfold with quiet satisfaction. Because the moment was about more than correcting the behavior of a few young bankers. It was about reminding the entire organization what true leadership looked like. He turned toward the management team. "From today forward," he said, "I want everyone in this bank to remember something simple." The room became silent again. Titles do not determine a person's worth. Several employees nodded slowly. "Every role in this building matters," Daniel continued. "From the executives making strategic decisions to the people who ensure this place is clean, secure, and welcoming for our customers." Grace stood quietly beside him, still holding the handle of her cleaning cart. "For years," Daniel said, "my mother worked in buildings just like this one. Many people never noticed her." He looked around the lobby. But without people like her, none of these offices could function. The message was clear. The bank was more than profits and investments. It was people. People whose effort kept the entire system running. Daniel gave a final glance toward the young bankers who had mocked Grace earlier. They stood quietly now, listening carefully. Because the lesson had reached them in a way no lecture ever could. Respect was not optional. It was the foundation of every strong organization. And that lesson had just been delivered by the one person they had underestimated the most. As the morning continued, the lobby slowly returned to its usual rhythm. Customers resumed their appointments. Employees returned to their offices. But something about the atmosphere inside City Trust Bank had shifted. The story of what happened in the lobby spread quickly through every department. People spoke about the cleaner who had raised the CEO, about the bankers who had laughed, and about the moment when respect replaced arrogance in front of the entire staff. Grace eventually picked up her mop again. Not because anyone expected her to continue working that morning, but because that was who she was. A woman who believed honest work deserved to be finished properly. Daniel watched her for a moment before heading toward the executive elevators. He knew that titles and positions often made people forget the struggles that shaped their lives. But he also knew something else. The greatest leaders never forget where they came from. Before the elevator doors closed, Daniel looked back at the lobby. His mother was still there, guiding the mop across the floor with the same quiet dedication she had shown for years. The difference now was simple. Everyone in the building saw her. And they understood. A river does not drink its own water. A tree does not eat its own fruit. The sun does not shine only for itself. The strongest people are often the ones who work quietly behind the scenes, building opportunities for others. Grace Okafor never asked for recognition. She only wanted her son to succeed. And on that ordinary morning inside a busy bank lobby, the world finally saw the truth. The most powerful man in the building had once been a small boy studying beside a tired mother. And everything he had become began with her. Stories like this remind us of something many people forget as they chase success. Respect should never depend on titles, salaries, or the clothes someone wears to work. Every building, every company, and every community stands on the effort of people whose names are often never mentioned. Security guards who stay awake through long nights. Cleaners who prepare workplaces before the first employee arrives. Workers who perform tasks quietly while others receive recognition. Without them, nothing functions the way it should. Grace Okafor never asked to be celebrated. She only did what she believed was right, working hard, raising her son with discipline, and refusing to let difficult circumstances define their future. And in the end, her sacrifices shaped the leader of an entire institution. If this story meant something to you, take a moment to subscribe and share it with someone who believes respect should be given to every honest worker. Because sometimes the people the world overlooks are the ones who make everything possible.